The South Pole was everything I expected it to be. Cold, endless, and unsettlingly silent. On August 3rd, I arrived at the research station with a small team, ready for the months of isolation that lay ahead. The landscape was an endless stretch of white, with no sign of life beyond the occasional gust of wind. The station itself was a fortress of steel and glass, but even inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every night, the silence was broken by distant, almost imperceptible sounds that no one else seemed to notice. By the second week, I started feeling restless. The days blurred into each other, with the sun hanging low in the sky, never truly setting. I found myself wandering the halls of the station late at night, searching for something, anything, to break the monotony. It was during one of these midnight walks that I first heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoing through the walls. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it. I mentioned the noises to my colleagues, but they just laughed it off, attributing it to the station's aging infrastructure or the shifting ice outside. But I knew better. The tapping had a pattern, like someone or something was trying to communicate. It was coming from one of the older, unused sections of the station, an area that had been sealed off after a fire decades ago. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The corridor leading to the old section was long and narrow, the lights flickering weakly overhead. As I approached the door, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. My hand hovered over the cold metal handle, my heart racing in my chest. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn back. But something urged me forward, a voice in the back of my mind whispering that I had to know what was behind that door. I opened the door to the old section, and immediately the air changed. It was colder here, more oppressive. The walls were lined with frost, and the dim lights barely illuminated the narrow hallway. As I stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind me, echoing through the stillness. The tapping had stopped completely, replaced by an almost deafening silence. My breath fogged the air as I moved cautiously down the corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. The old section was mostly intact, though signs of the fire were visible in the scorched beams and charred walls. I couldn't help but feel as though I was trespassing on something forgotten, something that should have remained sealed away. As I reached the far end of the corridor, I found a small room. Inside, everything was eerily preserved. Furniture covered in dust, papers strewn across the floor, and an old radio sitting on a desk. But what caught my attention most were the strange markings on the walls. The markings were unlike anything I had ever seen. Intricate symbols etched into the surface of the walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. I felt a chill run down my spine as I traced the patterns with my eyes. They seemed to shift and move, almost as if they were alive. My head began to pound, a dull ache growing more intense the longer I stared at them. I backed away, my mind racing with questions. What were these symbols? Who had put them here? And why? I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a soft whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My pulse quickened, and I started to feel lightheaded. I needed to get out of there. I hurried back down the corridor, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. By the time I reached the door, I was nearly running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I slammed the door shut behind me, the whispers ceased. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to collect myself. But even as I stood in the relative safety of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that room, something that wasn't going to let me go so easily. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The whispers had stopped, but the unease lingered, clinging to me like the cold air outside. My colleagues noticed my change in behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I had seen. How could I explain the symbols or the voices without sounding insane? So I kept quiet and tried to go about my routine, though every creak of the station sent a jolt of fear through me. The hallucinations began not long after. At first, they were small, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by when no one was there, but soon they grew more vivid. I would see figures standing in the hallways, their faces obscured by shadows. They never moved, just stood there, watching me. Each time, my heart would race, and I would blink rapidly, hoping they would disappear. And they always did, vanishing the moment I looked directly at them. But the fear they left behind lingered, gnawing at my mind. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the tapping. It was faint at first, almost like a distant echo, but it grew louder with each passing second. I bolted upright, my pulse racing. The sound was coming from directly outside my door. I held my breath, listening intently as the tapping grew more erratic, more insistent. My mind flashed back to the symbols on the walls, to the whispers that had followed me. I knew I should stay put, ignore it, but something pulled me from my bed. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the tapping continued, now coming from deeper within the station. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to a storage room at the far end of the building, a place I rarely visited. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping echoed from within. I hesitated for a moment, fear gripping me, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was an old desk, and on it lay a journal. I approached it cautiously, my hands trembling as I picked it up. The cover was worn, the pages brittle beneath my fingers. As I flipped through it, my eyes widened. It was a record of an expedition to the South Pole, long before our time. The entries detailed strange occurrences, voices in the night, figures appearing in the snow, and, most disturbingly, the same symbols I had seen on the walls of the old section. My breath caught in my throat as I read the final entry. It spoke of a researcher who had gone mad, claiming to be haunted by something that lived within the ice. He had vanished shortly after, leaving behind only this journal as a warning. My hands shook as I closed the book, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Whatever had driven him mad was still here, still watching, still waiting. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with thoughts of the journal, of the researcher who had disappeared, and of the strange symbols that seemed to follow me wherever I went. The station felt different now, darker, more menacing. Every sound echoed in my ears. Every shadow seemed alive with intent. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer, but leaving wasn't an option. The next supply plane wouldn't arrive for weeks, and the weather outside was too severe for any evacuation. As the days dragged on, the tapping returned, But now it was constant, a relentless rhythm that echoed through my mind even when the room was silent. My colleagues started noticing my increasingly erratic behavior, but I avoided their questions. I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. All I could do was endure, hoping that whatever was haunting me would lose interest. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. It was getting stronger, feeding off my fear. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I felt a presence in the room. My eyes shot open, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was the figure from my nightmares. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. My heart raced, but I couldn't move, frozen in place by some unseen force. The figure leaned closer, whispering in a voice that sounded like the wind through the ice. It spoke of the station, of the land beneath the ice, and of the secrets that should have remained buried. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The air in the room lightened, and I could breathe again. Whatever had haunted me was gone, leaving behind only the faint memory of its presence. The next morning, I packed my things and left the station as soon as the weather allowed. I never spoke of what happened there, but I carry the memory with me still, a reminder of the things we were never meant to uncover. The snow crunched beneath my boots as we set up camp on November 15th, deep in the forest. The trees were tall and dense, their branches heavy with snow that seemed to muffle every sound. There were 5 of us on this winter camping trip, far from civilization and surrounded by nothing but the quiet wilderness. It should have been peaceful, but from the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice or the distant howl of the wind. That first night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the breeze playing tricks on me, but the sound grew clearer, like voices just out of reach. I sat up, listening intently, but the whispers faded away, leaving only the oppressive quiet of the forest. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the cold getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. The next morning, I wandered through the snow near the camp, trying to clear my head. That's when I found them, footprints in the snow, leading away from our tents and deeper into the forest. They were too large to belong to any of us, and the pattern was strange, like something had been dragging its feet through the snow. I followed the tracks for a short distance before they abruptly stopped, vanishing without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of where the person or thing had gone. When I returned to camp and told the others, they laughed it off, teasing me for being paranoid. But I knew what I had seen, and the unease I felt only grew stronger. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. I lay awake, my heart pounding in my chest, as the voices seemed to circle our camp, coming closer with each passing hour. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The whispers didn't leave me alone. Each night, they grew louder, and now they felt almost human, as though someone was speaking right next to me, their breath cold against my skin. I hadn't slept in 2 days, my mind foggy from exhaustion and fear. On the 3rd night, I was certain I heard footsteps circling the camp, crunching softly in the snow. I sat up, heart pounding, but when I peeked outside my tent, there was nothing. Only the stillness of the forest, the shadows long and unmoving. That morning, our group discovered that one of us was missing. Adam's tent was empty, his sleeping bag undisturbed. We searched the area, calling his name, but there was no answer. The only thing we found were footprints in the snow, leading into the woods, just like the ones I had seen earlier. But these tracks weren't Adam's. They were larger, and just as before, they stopped abruptly, vanishing into thin air. Panic set in as we realized we were truly alone out here, with no way to contact help. Despite our fear, we continued searching, but by the end of the day, Adam was still nowhere to be found. We huddled around the campfire that evening, the flames casting eerie shadows on the trees around us. The silence was suffocating, each of us lost in our own thoughts, wondering what had happened to him. As the night wore on, the whispers returned, louder than ever, like voices carried on the wind. This time, the others heard them too. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke, as if acknowledging them would somehow make them more real. The next morning, another one of us was gone. Just like Adam, Jessica's tent was empty, her belongings untouched. The footprints were there again, leading off into the snow, only to disappear after a few meters. Fear gripped us as we realized we were being hunted by something we couldn't see, something that could move silently through the snow and take us one by one. My heart raced as I scanned the forest, knowing we were not alone and that whatever was out there was getting closer. The fear had become unbearable. None of us spoke, but we all knew it. Whatever was out there was toying with us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I barely slept that night, my senses on high alert, every rustle of the trees making my heart pound in my chest. The whispers were constant now, filling the silence with their unnerving murmur. They weren't just random noises anymore. They seemed to call my name, pulling me toward the forest. I fought the urge to follow, but it was getting harder to resist. By the fourth day, we were exhausted, physically and mentally. The snowstorm that had started the night before had only worsened, making it impossible to leave the camp. We were trapped. Our food was running low, and the isolation was taking its toll. My mind kept replaying the strange footprints, the vanishing friends, and the chilling whispers. I couldn't stop thinking about the forest, about what was hiding within its icy depths. Part of me wanted to run, to escape whatever was hunting us, but another part of me was drawn to it. That night, I sat by the dying fire, my back to the tents, staring out into the darkness. The snow fell softly around me, the wind howling through the trees. And then, just beyond the glow of the firelight, I saw them. Figures moving silently between the trees, their shapes shifting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, watching as they moved closer, their forms becoming clearer. They weren't like anything I had ever seen. Tall, gaunt, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back into my tent, pulling the flap shut behind me. I could hear them now, the figures moving closer, their whispers louder than ever. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the entrance. For a long moment, there was only silence, and I thought, just maybe, they had gone. But then, the whispers returned, louder, almost inside my mind. I knew I couldn't stay in that tent much longer. Whatever was outside wasn't going to wait forever. The moment I stepped out of the tent, the cold hit me like a wall, sharper and more intense than ever before. The fire had long since died, leaving nothing but a few glowing embers. The snow fell heavily, blanketing the camp in a thick, suffocating silence. I glanced around, expecting to see the figures again, but the forest was still. Yet, the whispers were all around me, swirling through the air, too close for comfort. I clutched the flashlight tightly in my hand, its beam cutting weakly through the falling snow. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. My breath came in short, panicked bursts as I ventured toward the edge of the trees, where the figures had been just moments before. I didn't want to go any further, but something compelled me forward, the whispers pushing me, pulling me deeper into the woods. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but there was no turning back now. As I entered the heart of the forest, I saw them again, standing still as statues, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to speak, to ask who they were, but no sound came from my lips. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I felt my mind slipping, the fear becoming unbearable as the figures slowly began to move toward me. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished into the trees, leaving me alone in the freezing darkness. The whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it was almost painful. I stood there trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I was alone again, with no sign of my friends or the mysterious beings that had haunted us. I stumbled back to camp, unsure of what I had just witnessed, my mind reeling. The forest had taken them, and now it seemed I was next. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, trapping us in the old mountain cabin on December 21st. The wind howled outside, battering the walls with icy gusts that made the wooden beams creak ominously. We were 4 hikers, stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the thick forest and mountains surrounding us. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy, almost suffocating, as though the walls held some dark secret. Faded photographs hung crooked on the walls, their black and white images of past occupants staring down at us like silent witnesses. The cabin was far from welcoming. Dust coated every surface, and strange symbols were carved into the walls, their meaning lost to time. We all felt it, the unease that clung to the place, seeping into our bones. No one said it out loud, but we all knew something was wrong here. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, barely warding off the cold. I sat by the flames, trying to shake the growing dread that tightened in my chest. Outside, the snow fell harder, piling up against the windows, cutting us off from the outside world. The others were restless too. We had planned to stay at a nearby lodge, but the storm had forced us to take shelter here, in this abandoned relic of a place. As the night wore on, strange noises echoed from the attic above, a soft thumping, like footsteps. We tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or the settling of the old wood. But deep down, we all felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of our necks, the feeling of being watched. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were filled with images of people freezing in the snow, their hands outstretched, begging for warmth. I jolted awake to find the cabin colder than before, frost creeping along the edges of the windows, despite the fire still burning low in the hearth. My breath fogged the air as I sat up, listening intently. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice carried on the wind, coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct, almost as if someone was calling my name from the shadows of the cabin. I sat up in my sleeping bag, eyes scanning the dimly lit room. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, convinced it was my mind playing tricks on me. The others were still asleep, unaware of the growing tension that clung to the air. The fire had nearly died out, leaving the cabin in near darkness, and the cold was seeping in from every corner, sharper than before. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the room and into the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the whispering became clearer, as though someone was waiting for me up there. My hand hovered over the cold metal handle of the attic door, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Every instinct told me to turn back, to wake the others, but something drove me forward, a need to understand what was happening. I opened the door and shone the light into the attic. The space was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture, broken crates, and boxes stacked against the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the cold was almost unbearable now, biting at my skin. But what caught my eye was a single, worn journal lying on a table in the center of the room. Its cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. Slowly, I approached it, feeling that familiar dread settling into the pit of my stomach. Flipping through the pages, I found entries written by someone who had stayed in this cabin years ago. They spoke of a curse, of something ancient that lived within the mountain, feeding off the cold and the fear of those who dared to stay. The more I read, the more my fear grew. The writer had experienced the same whispers, the same sense of being watched. But there was no ending to the journal, just a final, frantic scrawl. Do not trust the cold. It will take you like it took them. My heart raced as I dropped the journal, the air around me seeming to close in. The journal's warning echoed in my mind as I stood there, frozen in the attic's icy grip. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shapes across the walls. I hurried back downstairs, the whispering following me, growing fainter as I moved farther from the attic. When I returned to the main room, I found the others awake, huddled by the fire, their faces pale and drawn. They had heard the whispers too, and the fear in their eyes mirrored my own. We discussed leaving the cabin, but the storm had worsened, making any escape impossible. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows, and the snow piled higher against the door. The temperature inside had dropped even further, and frost now coated the walls and floors. We gathered more wood for the fire, but no matter how much we fed the flames, the heat never seemed to reach us. It was as though the cold was alive, feeding off our fear and growing stronger with each passing hour. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. One of us, Emily, started to complain of feeling unbearably cold, even as she sat right by the fire. Her skin turned pale, almost bluish, and she shivered uncontrollably. We tried to warm her, wrapping her in blankets, but nothing seemed to help. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and whispered that she had seen something dark and twisted, moving in the snow just outside the cabin. But when we looked, there was nothing there. Only the endless storm. The rest of the night passed in a blur of dread and whispered conversations. No one dared sleep, afraid of what might happen if we closed our eyes. The cold continued to creep closer, wrapping itself around us like an invisible force. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin itself was alive, feeding off our fear and desperation. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside felt like a warning, as though something was waiting for us to give in to the cold. By the final night, the cabin had become a prison, its walls closing in on us. The cold was no longer just an outside force. It was inside us, inside the very air we breathed. Emily had grown weaker, her skin turning a sickly gray, her breath barely visible in the freezing air. The rest of us were not far behind, our fingers numb, our thoughts sluggish. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, circling us like vultures waiting for us to fall. I could feel them pressing in, driving us closer to the edge. The storm raged on outside, but I knew it wasn't just the weather keeping us trapped. The cabin itself seemed to hold us in place, its ancient curse tightening around our throats. As I sat by the dying fire, I heard it again, the soft thumping from the attic. This time, it was different, more deliberate, almost like footsteps descending the stairs. My heart pounded as I turned to the others, but they were too far gone to notice, lost in their own battle against the cold. I was alone with whatever was coming for us. The door to the attic creaked open, and I saw it, a shadowy figure, its face obscured, standing at the top of the stairs. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, watching us with cold, dead eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was stare as the figure slowly faded back into the darkness, leaving behind only the whispers that seemed to seep into my mind, urging me to give in, to surrender to the cold. By morning, the storm had passed, but it was too late. Emily was gone, her body still and cold beside the fire. The rest of us were barely alive, our minds and bodies broken by the curse that had taken hold of the cabin. We left as soon as the snow cleared, but the cold stayed with us, deep in our bones, a constant reminder of the curse we had barely escaped. I've never gone back to the mountains, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, calling me back to the cabin's cold, dark embrace.